Hey everybody, welcome back to the So We Speak podcast. This is Cole Fakes, and I'm joined by Terry Fakes, and we are finding Jesus in the book of Genesis today. Now, we're doing it because it's the first one, but this has got to be one of the easier books in the Bible to find Jesus. We were talking before this, looking at our notes, and the problem here is not finding Jesus, it's keeping him to about 30 minutes in the podcast episode.
That's really true, but I would say that's counterintuitive. I mean, if you just think about Genesis and you don't know a ton about it, you'd say, okay, well, that's God creating the world and God creating people, and people fall and break their relationship with God, and now it's the story of, the people and developments, et cetera, and takes you all the way up to recorded history. I mean, really, that's sort of what you think of, and you go, so, what in the world does the creation of the world have to do with Jesus? So, I would argue it's counterintuitive, but I agree with you. The problem here is, what page do you not see Jesus on?
Right. One of the things about Genesis that is interesting for this particular question of how does Jesus fulfill the Old Testament is Genesis can mean the beginning, and it is the
Hmm.
beginning, but it can also mean the origin, can mean the
Right,
origin of something. And so in some ways, you have the phenomenon of the oak tree is present in the acorn. In
right.
Genesis, all the major themes that are going to be discussed in the Bible are there in seed form. And so it's not surprising to us that if God's plan from before the foundation of the world, Paul says, was to have Christ redeem his people, it's not surprising that you get glimpses of that even in the very beginning. In fact, on about the third page of the Bible, you're going to get a very clear promise about Jesus. So you're right. On the one hand, it makes sense that in the book of Genesis we would find this. But if you're just reading along, thinking about creation and Noah and Tower of Babel and Abraham and his kids, no mention of Jesus in there, and he's still a very long way off. And so what we want to do is we want to look and see how was God setting the stage with promises and plans? How was he introducing topics or ways for us to understand the way he works in the world that lead us directly to Jesus? And that is easy to see in the book of Genesis.
It is. I mean, if you think about it, it doesn't take very long. In chapters one and two, we get the creation story of the universe, and we tend to focus on the creation of the universe, and that's what we want to argue about. But if you read that story, you quickly realize that that story is mainly about us. It's about God creating humans. And in chapter three, you see this break. And the highlight of chapters one, two, and three is not the creating the universe, as awesome as that is. It's that humanity could turn away from God. And so you see, of course, Adam and Eve disobey and they eat from the forbidden tree. And God comes to find them in the garden and says, "Where are you?" And they said, "Why are you hiding?" And, Adam says, "Well, we realized we were naked. And so we sewed some fig leaves for ourselves and we're a little embarrassed to talk to you." And God said, "You have eaten from the tree, haven't you?" And they fess up and say, "Yes." Eve says, "The serpent deceived me and I did eat." And then you get God saying, "Well, let me tell you the consequences of this." And he starts, the interesting thing is, there are consequences for the serpent and the woman and the man. And he starts with the serpent. And in chapter three, he says, "Because you have done this, cursed are you above all of the beasts of the field." But then he goes on and he says something really enigmatic right at the end. In verse 15, he says, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and I will put enmity between you and her offspring. Her offspring will bruise you shall bruise his head and he shall bruise your heel." In other words, this enmity will result in a crushing, a bruising experience. And if you just read that, you think, what in the world is that talking about?
Yeah, this is a bit of the in literature you have the Chekhov's gun principle where if there's a gun hanging above the door in Act One, it's going to be fired by Act Four.
Right.
All the details are important here, and everything that gets introduced is going to be picked up or it's going to contribute to what happens in the future. So you have an enemy introduced in chapter three. First of all, you have the serpent, you have sin, so you have the problem that needs to be solved. And of course, from there, the high level summary of the Bible is actually very short. fix this problem of sin, defeat the enemy, bring humanity back into the garden with God. That's the whole plot of the Bible.
Right.
And it's all introduced here. So you really could, like they teach you in test taking skills in school, you could read Genesis 1 through 3 and Genesis 21 and 22 and get pretty much the whole storyline of the Bible. You just would miss out on a lot in the middle. But that's basically the whole plot. And so the question is, how is this going to happen? And in this promise, this is the first gospel promise. Sometimes it's actually called the proto-evangelion, which means the first gospel that
Hmm.
we get in the Bible. It's right at the beginning. God says, at some point, this is going to be fixed. And it's going to be fixed by a seed of the woman, a descendant of the woman, who is going to crush the serpent. And I think sometimes people read even more into this than you would read at first glance. But we know later that this proves to be true, that the crushing of the head of Satan and the bruising of the heel
Hmm.
literally plays out in Jesus, that he looks like he's dead as well from
Right.
stomping on the serpent. But when he comes back to life, we realize death has been defeated, and Jesus defeated death by dying. But now Jesus lives forever. It actually wasn't a fatal bite. It was
Right.
just a momentary pain, but the damage that's been done was fatal to the enemy. So you can see in these few words really the entire story of the gospel played out.
Yeah, I agree. And that's a really good point. As you look at the cross, and in light of this verse, the cross was the defeat of the serpent. Satan was defeated at the cross, and Jesus was bruised in that he had to endure death, but Jesus lives. And so it's counterintuitive a little bit, but it really does play this out. Is one blow was fatal and one was not.
Right. Yeah, but pretty soon after this, you actually get, I like to say you have the first promise of the gospel in chapter 3, verse 16, but then you have the first picture of the gospel in chapter 3, verse 21. So as you mentioned, when they sin, they realize they're naked. It's kind of a way of talking about the shame that they feel
Hmm.
because of what they've done. And so they knit together these fig leaves. And the interesting thing is in the Hebrew, the word that's used there, people kind of argue over what this means. It probably means something like an apron, which really captures the irony of this, is they try to cover themselves, but actually they're not covered at all.
Right.
And the point of it
Right.
is human beings will never be able to do anything to truly cover their sin. There's a futility to human
Hmm.
effort, sinful human effort in covering their sin. And so what happens is after God tells them the consequences of what's happened, then God does something for Adam and Eve. In verse 21 of chapter 3, it says, "And the Lord God made for Adam and his wife garments of skins and clothed them." So this is great because it shows that God is compassionate even after human beings sin, and it shows that he's going to make amends for what happened. And what you have in verse 21 is another framework that's needed to understand Jesus, and it points to him, and that is that there is going to be a sacrificial system. This is the first
Right.
sacrifice that's made in the Bible,
Right.
that an animal gives up his life to cover Adam and Eve in their sin. And so they wear these garments as a new covering. But notice what's happened. They're not completely restored, they're just
Right.
covered. And that in
Hmm.
and of itself is going to be a huge theme. We're going to talk about this when we do Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy and talk
Right.
about the law. It's a covering, but it's not the ultimate solution. It's a sacrifice. It keeps them, it clothes their shame, but it's not the ultimate sacrifice. The ultimate sacrifice is actually going to be a once and for all freedom from sin. The debt has been paid, which will be complete at the cross.
Yes, that's really insightful. And you're one of the few people I've heard really talk about this. But if you think about it, they are covered. God covers them. And so now all of a sudden their shame is lessened. But what they lose with that covering is there's no more transparency with God. I read the
Hmm.
nakedness in the garden to mean literally they were naked in the garden, but really what that means is there's absolutely no barrier between them and God. There's
Hmm.
intimacy, there's transparency, and the covering reduces their shame, but it reduces it at the expense of the intimacy and the transparency, which is going to
Right.
have to be regained in another way.
There's a breach in the relationship because of sin that is going to need to be repaired. So they don't just need a transaction to take place between them and God, as in sins have been paid for. They need a restoration of the relationship. And we're going to see that in a lot of ways. God orchestrates a series of relationships with his people, whether it be Israel or specific people like Moses and David, whether it be the prophecies of what is going to happen. You think of Hosea, who talks about the prophecy of a marriage that God is going to have with his people. There are going to be these ways of God presenting this relational side of things, but it's not going to be until Jesus that you can actually stand before God because he's entered this world. He's
Right.
become flesh. And Jesus is somebody that you can encounter. And I love the picture of the fig leaves because it shows us that there's an emotional and a relational part of this, not just a transactional or sometimes what we call a forensic, as in
Right.
you're guilty or not guilty. Now you've been let off, but everybody knows you did it, and the relationship is still broken. That's not what happens at salvation. The relationship is restored as well, and that's what Adam and Eve desperately need. That's why they're kicked out of the garden, is because they can't be in the presence of God anymore. And so they're expelled from the garden, from the presence of God. And it will take thousands and thousands of years for them to get back into the presence of God. And they'll do that through a
Mhm.
mediation in the Old Testament, but they'll do it face to face in the New
Right.
Testament.
In the New Testament. You're right. Well, and just to sum up these two for a minute, what's really interesting to me is here we are, we're three chapters into the story. So we're at the very beginning of Revelation. We are at what I would say is the darkest moment in human history, is the fall of humanity. And like you said, you can infer an oak tree from the seed. And there's a sense in which the seed contains the oak tree. In the depth of human failure is the seed and is the glimmer of light of restoration. So all the way back at the beginning, you see Jesus in a seed form, if you will, for
Hmm.
what will eventually be redemption.
Another thing that this helps us with in the Old Testament is sometimes the way we talk about the Old Testament and think about it is like God is kind of hatching a series of reactive plans.
Right,
People sin. So, oh man, what am I going to do now? I got to pick
right.
Abraham, flood the world, start
Yeah.
over, all this kind of stuff. Oh, like I got Israel, but that didn't work. King didn't
Hmm.
work. Temple didn't work. Tabernacle didn't work. Okay, well, we've run out of options, so we've got to send Jesus. And that is it's understandable to think about it that way, but that's really not what the Bible is portraying. It's one of the things you see is on page 3, Genesis chapter 3. God is already promising to send Jesus. It's not a backup
Right.
plan. It's not a recourse because everything else failed. This was the plan all along, was to send Jesus. For whatever reason, and this is where you can get really deep philosophically and theologically, for some reason, God knows that it's actually better to be redeemed than it is to be innocent. And that,
Hmm.
makes better sense sometimes than others. But God wants a redeemed universe. He wants the New Jerusalem. He doesn't want the Garden of Eden forever. He wants Adam and Eve to cultivate it. And his plan is actually not thwarted at all by human sin. And that's hard for us to wrap our mind around and square that with our responsibility and the contingency of all of that. But what Genesis 3 shows us is God was planning to send Jesus all along. It's not a backup plan. It was plan A from the very beginning, was to send Jesus to redeem the world.
Yes, you know that I think that's really an interesting point that you make, that this is plan A, because you can get the sense that God is reacting to events, and that's not the case. One interesting thing about your teaching on this and the idea that we just talked about the coverings, God kills the first animals, obviously give up their lives for this covering. And you get this idea of sacrifice. And as I look forward, that gets picked up again in an even more overt way before the law of Moses. I mean, it's very obvious when we get to Exodus. But in Genesis chapter 12, we get introduced. Now we're after the flood and Babel and all of those things, and we skipped over some things there. But God chooses Abraham, and Abraham believes God and goes to the place, and God's going to, give him this land. He's going to make him a great nation, and he's going to bless all the nations of the earth. But when he has a son, God asks him to go sacrifice his son Isaac. And so immediately, if you're listening, you go, whoa, here's this sacrifice idea again, but this is not what I'm expecting about Isaac being sacrificed.
Yeah, there's a whole lot here that we can't go into, but I would just encourage people to go back and listen to your Monday Thursday episode, because the covenant that's made with Abraham in Genesis 15 is one of the big precursors to what Jesus is going to do on the cross, the covenant that they make walking through the blood. And
Hmm.
that is the backdrop to Abraham having to offer his son, is he's made this covenant with God where his life is on the line for obeying and walking with God and trusting in his promises. So God demands his son, and this is a passage that's really difficult to understand. Why would God do this? Until you see what God is doing to show us who Jesus is and what the cost was. So he tells Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. He takes him, he does it. He is just about ready to sacrifice him. And it says in Genesis 22, starting in verse 11, but the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. And he said, Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. There's an interesting little thing here. Your only son. Abraham actually has another son at this
Right.
point. He's not the son of promise, and that's Ishmael. But even this is an interesting connection to Jesus, because again, sometimes we talk about it in a way that doesn't reflect this. But Luke, especially, is really insistent. Jesus is not the only Son of God, as in the only one that exists. He's the only begotten Son of God. He's the beloved
Right.
Son of God, because we are children of God, actually, as well. But we are not the only begotten like Jesus is. So your son, the son of promise, Isaac, the one offered on behalf of the other, and Abraham lifted his eyes up to the hill, eyes up and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son, in the place of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, The Lord Will Provide. And it is said to this day, On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. So this is a fascinating story.
Yeah.
Do you see Jesus in this story?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I love the scene where they're walking, Abraham and Isaac. Abraham's carrying the knife and the fire, and Isaac's carrying the wood. And Isaac says, "Well, we've got everything here, Father, but we don't have the sacrifice." And Abraham's answer was, and Abraham doesn't know at this point how it's going to turn out. He just said, God will provide the sacrifice.
Yeah,
And then that's Jesus right there is
right.
it's me walking to my death, if you will, and God has to provide the sacrifice in lieu of me, just as he does here with the ram caught in the thicket. And
Hmm.
so you see Jesus is the ram caught in the thicket, is the Lord has provided the sacrifice in our place.
Yeah. The in our place, I think, is one of the major takeaways here, that he offers the burnt offering instead of his son. Whereas God later, the whole reason that he does this is not just to toy with Abraham, it's to show the great cost that God had his son die instead of burnt
Hmm.
offerings, in place of
Hmm.
burnt offerings, because that's what they were doing up until that point. And finally, Jesus comes as the true sacrifice. And so Abraham did not have to offer his only son. We'll get to this when we do Exodus, but the Israelites at the Passover did not have to offer their sons,
Right.
because God offered his son in place, and he provided his son. Of course, there's a great connection here. This Mount Moriah is the mountain where Jesus is crucified. So the Temple Mount kind of extends over. You have Mount Zion, but you also have Mount Moriah kind of on this same ridge. And Mount Moriah is likely the place where Jesus is crucified. And so on that mountain, on the very mountain that
Hmm.
Abraham was, the Lord will provide. And it's just a beautiful picture of what God would do later. And he would fulfill this story that he was teaching Abraham, that he would send his only son, his only begotten son, in our place, dying instead of us.
Yeah, and I love that this story, we tend to think about the whole sacrificial system in lieu of Moses, who's going to show up 600 years later in the story. But I think it's interesting to see Jesus and the sacrificial idea here before we see it in the covenant with Moses, where it becomes very commonplace and very obvious that the people are postponing their sin. They're
Right.
covering their shame. You see this theme running through it. They're covering their shame by the blood of an animal. Here, an animal, God has provided a sacrifice in lieu of the person. In the law of Moses, these animals are going to be to cover over the sin, not to deal with the sin, but to cover over the sin. It's interesting as you see that thread and you know it, you begin to see it all the way through the book of
Right.
Genesis.
Yeah, another point here not to miss is that Abraham, as you mentioned earlier, has faith in God's provision of the sacrifice. So he says, "The Lord will provide." And he's trusting in God. The author of Hebrews says that he must have been thinking that God would raise Isaac from the dead
Right.
because Isaac was the promised son. He knew that God was not going to go back on his
Right.
word. So he knew if Isaac dies, he doesn't have any kids yet. He's going to have to raise him from the dead because he's going to be true to his promises, which you would think would be one of those points where you say, okay, now we're getting a sense of what the whole gospel story is going to be: sacrificial death with resurrection afterwards. And that is what happens to God's own son. The other interesting thing is Jesus sees a gospel theme in this because when he's talking to the Pharisees and they're talking about Abraham, he says, before Abraham was, I am. And they think that's just the craziest thing they've ever heard. But he
Hmm.
says, Abraham saw my day and was glad. And so you can go back and hunt through Abraham's life and think, when did this happen? What exactly is he referring
Right.
to in seeing the day of Jesus and being glad? It has to be this story. It has to be this story. Here he
Right.
sees, oh, God is going to provide the sacrifice. I mean, if you take Genesis 15, the covenant, death, being owed, you take this story, God saying, I'm going to provide on the mountain, it shall be provided. This is the place where Abraham sees the gospel acted out before him. And so he sees Jesus' day, what Jesus is going to ultimately do, and he's glad because he sees his own salvation. He trusts in the promises of God. So this is a very, very clear gospel theme, gospel story that runs through Genesis.
But skipping ahead a little bit, probably to me, one of the clearest pictures of Jesus, but it's only a partial picture of Jesus, but one of the clearest picture as we move on through Genesis, Abraham has Isaac and Isaac has Jacob and Jacob has the 12 sons, one of whom is Joseph. And the book of Genesis ends with what I'll call the Joseph cycle or the Joseph story. When the story moves to focus on Joseph, gets sold into slavery by his brothers. You think, well, he's done. That's the end of that story. Let's get on with the brothers. But it doesn't. It follows Joseph more than it follows the brothers. And you know the story. Joseph suffers tremendous things. I mean, you can't come back from some of the things that happened to Joseph, or you shouldn't come back from the things that happened to him. He gets some success in Potiphar's house, and then he's thrown in jail. He prophesies correctly to the prisoners, but they forget him. And eventually he becomes number two in all of Egypt, which is an amazing story. And of course, his brothers end up in front of him as a result of a drought. And he says, you intended harm for me, but God intended it for good. Look how this has turned out. You are all now saved because of what I went through. And so Joseph is really a Messiah figure, the suffering servant that's going to end up doing good for God's people because of his own suffering.
Yeah. About a year or so ago, we had Sam Amadi on the podcast, whose dissertation is on
Hmm.
Joseph as a type of Christ, as a picture of Christ. And you wouldn't think that that's disputed, really, but there's no reference to Joseph in the New Testament as a type of Christ. And so in certain circles, uh, they don't like to take a type unless a New Testament writer does that. I'm not in that circle. I think we can find these
Right.
things everywhere, whether they're mentioned or not. I think we just use our biblically informed imaginations to see these patterns. But in some scholarly literature, it is one of those things where if it's not explicitly mentioned, and so he goes back and actually finds some places that he thinks there are some explicit references back to Joseph, and that whole conversation is about how Joseph's life is an image of Jesus and what Jesus is going to do. But I think the easiest way to see this is he's in Potiphar's house. He is falsely accused. He's thrown into a pit. He dies in a sense there in the pit. And then he is raised up to rule over the kingdom and saves his brothers and his family
Hmm.
by forgiving them and providing for them, by providing food for them and bringing them
That's the
to a land.
gospel.
I mean, that's the exact gospel story. And
Hmm.
Joseph is showing us this pattern of what God loves to do. God loves to tell stories like that. And so it's not surprising to us that that's the story of Jesus. That's the gospel picture written everywhere in the universe.
Yeah, exactly. And I know we'll get to this in Isaiah, but Isaiah 53, the famous passage that everybody accepts as a messianic promise, it's not a King David looking figure. It's a suffering Joseph looking figure. And the Jews at the time of Jesus were really debated about what is the Messiah going to be like. We know he's going to be a conquering king, and we love that. But we got all these passages that talk about him being a suffering servant as well, and they
Hmm.
really weren't sure what to do with that. But I do think we see that suffering servant all the way back in the book of Genesis. We don't have to wait until Isaiah to get that image. You get that image in the very first book of the Bible.
That's right. Yeah, all through, and we've just hit, four of the big places here. You could find this in other places, that the Tower of Babel, at the flood. You can find this with Jacob and Esau. I mean, you can see this in
Right.
Isaac. You can find this everywhere, and it is our hope that now, once you see what God's doing in some of these patterns and promises, that you too will be able to see Jesus in the book of Genesis. Of course, next time we're going to be doing Jesus in Exodus. And as one commentator said, Exodus is the only thing that ever happens in the Bible. It's just Exodus over and over and over
Over and
again.
over again.
We'll look at that claim next week when we look for Jesus in the book of Exodus. So join us next time on the So We Speak podcast.